We are going to talk about creating winter terrariums. Um, and this was one of those ideas where you start going down the I want to do something new with plants rabbit hole, and you just see what comes up after you do some research. So, um, gonna bring up our candy jar terrariums. So this is what our objective will look like for our candy jar terrarium. So if we see here, this looks very similar to the old candy style machines that you used to get gumballs from. And it's a really simple and easy setup. Um, for a terrarium. It's a little bit more complicated than just a basic jar terrarium. Um, but here we've got all of our materials that we can see here, just a couple of pictures, and we'll talk about this as we go. We've got a terracotta plant saucer here that goes with this terracotta pot, a fish bowl as our terrarium, and then the inner workings of a terrarium, which are basically the same. Um, but today, before we start getting into how to create and assemble a terrarium, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what a terrarium is exactly. We are going to talk about um, the specifics that go into making a terrarium, different plant options, container options. So while our winter focus for this fall is the candy jar terrarium, which we'll talk about, um, we're going to talk about how you can make this a terrarium that you can give for any event or create for any event. Myself, when I do the candy jar terrariums, I really like giving these as holiday presents to my friends and family. Um, so this can be an idea for you to take if you want to do some handmade holidays for a friend or a family member, or even if you want to um, look at um, a little side business. So we'll start off with what a terrarium is. So, um, as much as I love making terrariums, I will admit this is an AI photo of a terrarium. I have not been able to get a well-established terrarium to create a multi-level terrarium like this, but eventually I would like to get to that terrarium master level to be able to do something very similar to this. So when we talk about terrariums, they are glass or plastic containers that are filled with small plants. They can either be tightly closed or they can be um, open to the air. And this has become a novel way for us to grow plants with minimal effort, either indoors or sometimes during the summer and growing season when it's warm enough, we can take our terrariums outdoors as well. A little bit about the history of terrariums. So terrariums have been used back all the way to 25 um, 100 years ago in Greece, where they were growing plants in transparent containers, um, and even back to the hanging gardens of Babylon. Now, the actual terrarium that we think of was credited to Dr. Nathaniel Bagshot Ward, who was a 19th century physician who lived in London. Now, um, as with many different things in horticulture, when we look at horticultural history, Um, some of the names that stick out tend to be people that actually had another career and just took a idea or an interest in plants, like Dr. Ward. And so when we continue to look at the history, um, in 1842, there was a book that was published called On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. Now, where this came about from was that in 1829, Dr. Ward first noticed the effects of a hermetically sealed glass container that he had placed a chrysalis of a sphinx moth into a glass container with a little bit of damp soil at the bottom of the bottle, and then he closed it and covered it with a lid. About a week later, he noticed that there was a fern and some grass seedlings that had sprouted from that soil. His interest peaked, and he saw that because the container was closed, that the evaporated moisture started condensing on the walls of the bottle during the day, and then as the conditions changed throughout the day into the evening, that the condensed moisture ran down the side of the bottle into um, the soil, which was maintaining the constant humidity within um, the container. So as he used this glass container to rear butterflies and grow plants, it began widely being adopted during this time for introducing plants into different British colonies around the world. His first experiments with plants under glass started in 1830, and then in 1833, a man by the name of George Lod Lodges used a Wardian case to ship plants to and from Australia. And so when we start thinking about our modern day conceptions of what a terrarium is, Wardian cases have really been that starting point after Dr. Ward's um, initial discovery. And so what a Wardian case is a large enclosed container that you use to grow plants either in your home or to transport them long distances. Now, I'm going to show you some examples here of different Wardian cases. And some of these Wardian cases you can still um, find when you go to different stores. Um, when I look at this one right here, um, this one is a Wardian case that's built onto a brick um, container. But this top portion right here, where you can see it's got different handles on it for it to be modular and movable. But these are common now. We won't find one with the um, modular design or the mobile design like this one, where it's a brick bottom with handles to be moved if needed. But this upper portion right here is what we can often find. The glass panels with the adjustable roofs and the openable roof panels um, for them to be used. Um, this one up here at the top left, where my cursor is, this one would be very reminiscent of what we nowadays call a um, a high table or a raised bed um, terrarium, where they've lifted it up off on some pegs and are growing in the soil right here with the modular top to collect the humidity and allow the sun to pass through. This first one right here, this bell jar example, this is very similar to Dr. Ward's initial experiment, where he put the chrysalis and the fern, or the soil that contained the fern and the grass in there. Now, if anybody is into looking at different crafting or um, other types of apps like that, you may have seen ones like this that look very similar to old types of aquariums, where they have this kind of table design and then have the terrarium built on top. Now, this one right here, this one actually has a terrarium on top of a terrarium, which is very interesting to see. All right, so how do you decide? Do you do a closed one? Do you do an open one? Do you do a dish garden? All of these are going to be different types of terrariums. And the closed terrarium is one that is most often chose because it cuts down on the level of maintenance that you have to do. You don't have to water it as often. You can let the plants grow naturally, collect the sunlight as they need to. And you can really, if you remember any of those infomercials, from the 90s and the 2000s where you just start something and then forget it. Um, and in the case of our terrariums, we put them in a place where we don't often forget about them, but it's nice to take a vacation sometimes. And so doing an open terrarium or a dish garden, you're going to have to water those more frequently, which if you have a good system in place for your watering, then that is not a issue. For the different container types that we are able to use, the only requirement here is that it needs to be clear or transparent to let the light in. Um, so using either a glass or a plastic type container is really the only limitation or caveat, if you will, for using a to starting a terrarium. Some different types of examples might be an empty fish bowl, like we're doing with the candy jar terrarium. An old fish tank can be turned into a terrarium. Um, in my house, we're very into upcycling or recycling. So every time we get a new food item that comes in a jar or one of those very tall party-sized snacks, we recycle and wash those out and reuse them for different things. Making terrariums out of recycled materials is one of those ways that can help cut down costs if you are doing a gifting of your terrariums. Um, you can use an old jug or a bottle, remembering that it just needs to be clear. Um, this example down here in the bottom right, I have not risked trying this one yet, because you have to be very delicate, is turning a light bulb into a terrarium. And I wanted to share when I've done programs in the past throughout the community, um, it is great to contact people in your community using either a free or for sale page, or if you know of a business um, that does food service or drink service that has a lot of recyclables that could be donated. Um, these are just some examples that are commonly used. So this one here is an old candle. glass that can be used either with the lid as a closed terrarium or an open terrarium. A fish bowl. This one was from a yogurt container. The back ones are drink containers that were donated. Um, but these are just a couple of examples where you could ask community organizations to help cut down on their trash and recycling. Um, and they're usually very grateful to have that go to further use. For our growing media in our terrarium, so we are going to use a standard potting mix or a cactus mix or a succulent mix, depending on what you're putting in there. Um, but it needs to be clean, well drained, and high in organic matter, which is why we most likely choose a prepackaged potting soil or a potting mix that is created from peat and perlite, and sometimes has vermiculite in it because it's a well-balanced option to not only hold those nutrients, but as your plants are growing and the terrarium gains some age, those peat remnants that are in there will break down and help to feed some of your plants. If you want to start making your own media, I put this out there because there are some people who are interested in making their own terrariums and making their own media to use. You'll want to still use peat moss, which you can get at any local garden center, or some of the big box stores also have that as well. And 1 part of a rich garden soil. So if you have some extra garden soil in your yard, just taking 1 part of that and 1 part of peat moss, mixing it, and then adding some moisture, covering it with some aluminum foil to make sure that it doesn't dry out. And then you'll place it in your oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes. And this will steam your potting mix to get rid of any kind of bacteria or fungi that might be in there that we wouldn't want to put in a terrarium. Um, why having that in your terrarium can be an issue is if we are sealing your container for your terrarium and adding moisture to it, anything that is in there, including bacteria or fungi, can make a home in your terrarium where then we have to start working on that maintenance plan to eliminate it so that it doesn't continue to grow. I recently opened a terrarium that looked fine, that I had done in a program in August, and the smell was quite terrible. It was very similar of rotting eggs, and that was just because there was too much moisture. And when we were assembling the terrarium, some of our bacteria from the air or from our breath when we were breathing in there, assembling the terrarium, had started to grow and had caused the plants to rot. So that's one thing just to keep in mind as we move forward. When we talk about fertilizing a terrarium, it is usually not necessary to add fertilizer for terrariums because we don't want them to grow rapidly. We want them to, we're going to be putting small plants in there. We don't want them to stretch or to grow really tall really fast because depending on the size of our container, we really just want them to have a nice, relaxed lifestyle. If you're using a potting mix, most of those come with a starter fertilizer charge that will provide enough nutrients for your terrarium. If you do need to fertilize, you only want to offer fertilization during the active growing season and using a houseplant fertilizer. Um, the active growing season would be from about April to about October. And that would be the only time that you would want to add fertilizer because you're having an increase in light, you're having an increase in temperature, and um, that really, that active period um, is when you want to add the fertilizer. If you add fertilizer from, let's say, November to March, then you could have a salt toxicity that builds up in the soil from having that excess fertilizer in there, and that could have an effect on the roots of your plant. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about getting started with the history and the fertilization and the medium, let's talk about plant choices. So what do we want to plant? As we can see here in this terrarium example, they have different house plants in here that they've put in, a pine cone, um, a stick with some lichens on it, as well as um, some moss that is in there. So lots of different things to choose from. And this is where your creativity really starts to take off. So um, every time I do a terrarium workshop with a group of people, no two terrariums will look the same, even though we're using the same materials, the same um, additions that you can put in there, none of them look the same. And so one of the things to consider is where you're going to be putting your terrarium. Are you going to have it in your dining room as a centerpiece for your table? Are you going to have it as um, a plant piece on a nightstand or an end table? Is it going to be on a shelf or near a window? Different things to think about because it'll have different temperature and light requirements. Um, One of the things I will share from my example that I just used about the terrarium I did in August. Um, I had mine sitting on a file cabinet in my office right in front of a south window, getting plenty of light. But we started having the heat on, and I think that's what accelerated the growth and decay of the plants was because of that heat change that the plants were not used to, and the bacteria started to grow. So when we use plants, we want to use plants that have a low dense growth. Usually that is best because depending on your terrarium size, you may not have a lot of height. You may have more in the way of width for your container. Large plants used in a terrarium, if it's not an open terrarium, you'll have to do more cutting back or pinching of that terrarium plant to make sure that it's not encountering the lid or the roof of the bottle. So here in the picture, we've got some different colored cacti, um, some different succulents here that are available. And on our next slide, we can see this is a picture of a large terrarium. And so when you look at this, there are some taller plants in here, but the plants that are taller don't go into the upper third of the terrarium, please. Terrarium container, excuse me. This is my favorite part of a terrarium because you get to decide your theme. So, um, what are you feeling creative for that day? Are you wanting to do a woodland theme, a desert, a tropical theme? The last couple that I've done have been a beach theme where we've used different shades of blue, pebbles, and some sand to create a beach scene. Um, we've put our potting soil in there on kind of a hilled effect so that um, it looked like there was a hill, and then as you went down the hill, you went into the blue water area. Then some different possible options that you could have. If you have a favorite movie or a favorite franchise, you could look at doing a scene from that movie or that show. Um, and the last one that I put on here um, has a very famous plant associated with it. And so that could be your center plant attraction if you do a carnivorous plant themed terrarium. All right, so when we look at what to plant in a terrarium, we're going to separate our plants into size groups. So if you ever purchase terrariums, plants from a garden center, or if you buy them from a big box store, one of the things that I do when I get home or when I get ready for teaching a class is I will separate them into these three categories of small, medium, and tall plants. That way, this kind of gives the participants, as well as myself and you in this case, an idea of what you have to work with, what parts of the terrarium you can manipulate, and then depending on the size of your container, or if you have different size containers, which plant options would fit more into that terrarium. When we look at light conditions, most of our terrarium plants are going to fit under that house plant um, light condition. So a medium light, if you have a south or western facing window, they're usually going to like indirect sunlight. Um, you can put your succulents and your terrariums under a grow light or have a grow light hitting them in some case depending on how your plants are set up. Um, I know in my house right now, in our jungle, as we call it, we have a lot of plants on the east side of our house and in the center of our house. So we have grow lights on in our dining room for the plants that are in there. So they can live their best life right now as the days are getting shorter and the temperatures are starting to change. Not only inside, but those environmental conditions are changing outside as well. Um, One of the things with a terrarium is even if you place it outside for, let's say you're having a picnic or something and you want to use it as a um, centerpiece, you want to give it a little bit of shade. Never put your terrarium into direct sunlight because it has that magnifying effect on sunlight and heat. So you could end up burning plants if it's in too direct of sunlight or in front of a window that doesn't have some solar mediation in there. The temperature for our terrarium plants are going to like your normal house conditions. Many of our terrarium plants are going to be tropical in nature, and whatever environment you have them in your house and they become acclimated to is one that they're going to enjoy. When we put terrarium plants into a terrarium, they are going to have a higher level of humidity if it is a sealed container, um, which is one thing to think about depending on plant choices. Um, so I'm going to just pick a common house plant that is very um, fiddle when it has any kind of movement or anything, and that's a fig. So even if you have a cutting of a fig that you want to put in a terrarium to start it growing, it's going to be a plant option that you're not going to have very high success with because they are very fickle. They like being planted and centered around one environment and then um, not being moved. So here are some plant examples that we can use. Um, if we're doing a desert themed terrarium, um, kalanchoes or panda plants are always great ones to put in there. Hens and chicks, crassulas, echeverias are going to always be a hit in terrariums. Um, the sempervivums are ones that are on the more inexpensive side, and you can find them even in big box stores. So if you're looking at giving these for a handmade holidays project, that could be one, as well as any of these that um, break off easily. You can let them callus, propagate them that way, and then put them into um, your terrarium for them to start growing and to be gifted to another person. If you're going to look at a um, carnivorous um, open container, some different ones that you could do are having some sundews, some Venus flytraps, or some pitcher plants. And these will also help cut down if you have any insects that happen to be traveling in as the temperature gets colder. This is a great one to make into an open terrarium and then include into any plant shelf that you might have because it'll help cut down on some of those insects. And then we have the open air plant terrariums, and these are very popular for use at decorations for different gardens, indoor buildings, very popular wedding plant of having some air plants available. All right, now we're going to get on to the assembly. And so starting on the assembly, one of the things that I always find very helpful, and you'll find all of this in the handouts that were sent out for today's presentation, but I included a tools list. So having some kind of dowel rods or some chopsticks will help depending on how big your container is. If it's very tall and has a small opening, that really does help you manipulate plants. On some of the not wide mouth jars, I have trouble getting my hands in, but I'll use a doweling rod or some chopsticks um, to help manipulate the plants as well as make a hole for those plants to go into. Having some scissors, a kitchen spoon, not only for drainage, moving drainage materials around, but also adding in the media. A large spoon is also going to help you if you want to make a hill or a mound in your terrarium. Having an atomizer or a spray bulb, bulb type sprayer for adding some misting water if you need to. And then this one I found, it was actually a suggestion from somebody in my class of having a stick with a wire loop on it. So if any of you are used to using clay tools, something very similar to that to help lower a plant into place and set it into the perfect spot for you. So that's our tools list. On our accessory list, because we had our plants, we have our tools. Now we can add any of our decorations that we would like. So rocks, gravel, shells, moss, um, different ceramic figures, dried flowers, other natural materials. One thing I always remind folks, um, if you're going to do any kind of found object, for this for this project is using rocks and shells. You want to boil those in a rolling boil for 5 minutes to help sterilize them, and then put them um, in a place to cool. And then once they are cool and they've been disinfected, then you can use them in your terrarium. Um, I like using some of my kids' old toys and figures, um, and you can use those. Just use a alcohol solution or a 10% bleach solution to clean those off and sterilize them, because most of those could be plastic. Um, and so that helps clean them, and then allow those to dry before putting them in your terrarium as well. All right. So for our assembly, we're going to start on assembly now. And depending on your terrarium, your theme, your materials, you're going to have a variation of size, color, and texture for your plants and what you put in there. You want it to be just like any kind of work of art that you put together. And for those of you that have been to presentations of mine before, I am not a crafty person. I am not an artsy person. I'm very science brained. Um, but this is something where you just let your creativity take over. And I always remind myself every time I start, we are our harshest critics. And so, although we may not like it and we want to keep changing it, sometimes less is more. Um, and so just just some things to remember, that depending on how you're going to display your plant, um, or your terrarium, your plant placement may be different. If you're going to use it on a centerpiece for a table where you're going to be viewing it from all sides, you could look at this terrarium and think, I'm going to put all of my plants in here, and then this is going to be a 360-degree scene or presentation that I want to do. If you are going to put this up against a wall, so let's say we have our wall um, on this side, we've got some smaller plants here and some larger plants. And so we always put our taller plants towards the back and the shorter ones toward the front. So you want to create that scene of that stairwell, um, the stair step approach of having different layers of texture, color. And then one of those things that always can help is to sketch it out or to plan it out. For our candy jar terrariums, there is some pre-work that we have to do. So we have to gather not only our tools and our plants and our materials, but we also need to get a fishbowl, a terracotta pot, and then the terracotta saucer that goes with that size pot. Now, one of the things that um, you want to try and remember or try to do is, if you're using a terracotta pot and a saucer for this, you want to make sure that your saucer covers the top of your fishbowl. And so for this one, um, this was a um, terracotta pot that I got at the local garden center nearby, and the fishbowl I got from one of our local dollar stores. And so I actually ended up getting the fishbowl first, and then I took the fishbowl with me to the garden center to get a saucer that would fit the top of this, and then the corresponding pot that would fit for the bottom. So if you want to do any painting of it, if you want to make it a different color or decorate it as you're giving it as a gift, you want to do that with the pot first. Um, for the program that I did here, I just went ahead and spray painted some of the terracotta pots red, and then we had black. And then I brought markers, permanent markers and whiteout markers for the kids to decorate them if they wanted to. And then we built the terrarium after we hot glued the fishbowl to the bottom of the painted pot. And so that's the next thing that we'll need is either some epoxy or some hot glue to just put on the bottom here and put these together. While we were working on um, some plant selection and letting the glue dry, we did add some extra um, rocks and marbles in here just to help weigh the fishbowl down as it dried, so it really secured in place. And then when we were ready to assemble the fishbowl part of the terrarium, we dumped those out and then started back on our assembly. All right, and so I've mentioned here a couple of times, you can layer it like this. So we have a little beach theme going on here with some sand on top of our potting soil, and then they've built up the sides using different types of moss, incorporating some living stones as kind of a stair step here to step down, and then some rocks here in the back. Reminder that before you plant your terrarium, you want to make sure to disinfect your um, terrarium container on the inside with just some hot soapy water and rinse that out thoroughly. So starting on our assembly, we want to add our drainage material. And so for my terrarium example here, um, I use some of these stone pellets or stone marble pellets, excuse me, that you can get. Um, and you can also use rock or gravel. What this is really for is to create a barrier for any excess water to drain into. And then we're going to use some activated charcoal with the gravel and stones to help eliminate any chemicals or bacteria that might filter through down into this excess water. Um, so depending on your container, you want to do about a half-inch layer of the gravel. Some people would use crushed pots or other drainage materials, whatever you have on hand. Um, when I've done this in the past, I tell people not to go above a fourth of the container because we want to have a drainage material and then we want to have plenty of room for our plants to sit and grow into, and then plenty of room for our plants to be planted and grow into. Um, then after we get the drainage material and the activated charcoal in there, we're going to add another fourth to a half, depending on your plants, of the growing media. And so after you get the charcoal in there, you're going to put the growing material in there. And one of the things I always do before I put it in there is not to use dried. I will moisten it with water before I put it in there. So then I have a starting point on my moisture level. Um, so I may not have to add additional moisture once we've started. Then again, I mentioned the sizing and shaping of the different plants. At this point, I've separated them out into my talls, my mediums, and my shorts. And then I've also taken the opportunity, as you can see here in this container, to remove anything that would have disease or dying, yellowing, any indication that something may be off for the plant. I was using some rooted succulents for this terrarium. And so I did do a little bit of root pruning down here just to help so that it would not be pushing itself out of the material, or we didn't push into the drainage material as we were um, assembling. This is another thing that I picked up is a long-handled tweezers to help insert um, your plants if you don't have one of those um, loop metal loops on a stick, as well as I had a preschooler at the time, and so um, we were using one of the activity dry erase activity mats um, as our plant mat, and then we could just discard anything that fell on here for easy cleanup. Um, So with our assembly, we want to make sure that we keep the foliage from touching the sides of the container. Remember, this is where the condensation is going to run down. We don't want that to run down onto the plants and cause any moisture issues or disease issues. After you've planted, um, if you need to, mist any of the plants to remove any debris. Um, and then you want to allow the container to remain open until that foliage is dried off. And so here you can see this is an open terrarium that they've used the seashell theme, and they've got it growing out. So for this one, at that point, you'd be done. So I'll show you a couple of examples of ones that I've done. So here is my very first candy jar terrarium, and I am very open to admitting that I did not follow what I taught. And my plant material here was touching the side and started touching the top. One of the things that I learned from doing the candy style terrarium is that we put too much of the media in here. And so I didn't have a lot of growing room for this terrarium. When I was doing the middle terrarium and the next terrarium to it, you can see I've got plants in the corner, but they're not touching the outside. So there's room for that moisture to grow down. I use some stones as a walking path through here and use the plants as different kinds of more of a natural walking path that you might find. And then in this last one, if anybody has seen any of the superhero movies that are out there, this is one of the characters after he eliminates half of the universe. He's on his farm at the end, enjoying, and so I recreated this in my interpretation for just one of my themes that I was doing. And I realize we're getting close to time here, so I've just got a couple of slides on maintenance. So closed terrariums, if you do not see any condensation, on there, you may need to add some water, usually about every 4 to 6 months. If you do start to notice a lot of condensation on there, you may need to vent your terrarium, and that's just simply removing the lid for an hour or so to allow it to dry out. So some basic rules of terrariums, very similar to maintenance for houseplants. Don't overwater, don't underwater, remove any dying or diseased um, leaves as you notice them. Just like a houseplant, you want to turn your terrarium frequently um, so that instead of growing towards the light source, they spiral up and grow normally. And then if you have any that are tall or fast growing plants, make sure to frequently pinch or prune as needed to help maintain your terrarium. Eventually, you may get to the point where you need to transplant or divide some of your plants because the terrariums have outgrown, or the plants have outgrown the terrarium they're currently in. Here's just a couple of resources that I found in putting this presentation together. There's a lot of great extension sources out there, as well as a couple of books on how to put terrariums together. Thank you to my my coworkers with the University of Illinois for helping with some photos for this presentation, as well as some Creative Commons. Andrew mentioned at the beginning, if you want to rewatch this or a previous other program, you can go to this link, which will take you to YouTube, to find all of our videos and webinars that have been recorded. And then before we get to any questions you might have, I'm going to pause on this slide for you to either write down the web link on the bottom, which is go.illinois.edu/winter terrariums, or if you have a QR code scanner on your phone, to scan the QR code and take the survey. I really do appreciate those results. We use them for not only to evaluate my presentation today,